Hello, MCU fans. Today is going to be my review of Scott Lang's new book, Look Out for the Little Guy. In particular, I'm going to focus on timeline and time heist lessons from the book, but also include some of the fun little Easter eggs. Now, I will say the book is about a 50-50 split between MCU lore and Scott Lang's self-help advice, which makes sense. It is an autobiography. I'll admit I wasn't as interested in those chapters, but the MCU lore chapters were awesome. Lots of fun stuff in here. Also, I do want to mention a big thanks to PapaWorks, a member of the Discord server. PapaWorks read the book and took extensive notes and posted those on the Discord, and I used those as well as my own extensive notes to put together this video. So thank you, PapaWorks. You rock, buddy. Also, there will obviously be spoilers for the book, so I guess if you haven't read the book yet, then save this video for later. But assuming you've either read the book or, don't plan to, then hey, let's dive right in and see what we can find out. All right, so as I always mention, we do have a September contest running. All you have to do to enter is be a subscriber, leave a comment, and the winner will be chosen at random and announced in early October. And we'll choose from one of these 3 books, including our book of today, right? Look Out for the Little Guy. So best of luck. All right, so the way this video is going to be set up is I will cover pages in the book, which I mentioned at the top in case you do have a copy and you want to go back and read that section in the book. But I'm not going to go in order by the book, but more in order by the MCU timeline. So in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see where we are in the timeline as I discuss each thing. Starting with WHIH Newsfront did some news stories about the Ant-Man movie when it first came out, and you can still find those on Disney Plus if you go down into the extras for the Ant-Man movie. But in the one where they talked about Scott Lang working at VistaCorp, notice they have a picture of him from a VistaCorp event in 2004. And then in the top left, that's why I have Newsfront with July of 2004. So you'll see that always up there telling us where we are on the timeline. So the question I'm looking at here is, when did Scott work at VistaCorp? Well, this is actually a little bit of a retcon. They probably actually forgot this was even out there because in the book he says, but how about when life sends you unexpectedly packing from your gig of 3 years and straight into a jail cell? All right. In fact, this is really the only surprise retcon, if you will, to me in the whole book. So that's pretty good. It's pretty consistent with what we know in the MCU. So I'm moving it to July 2009 for when he started working at VistaCorp because after 3 years, of course, he does the heist. So one thing I'd always wondered, the heist is in July of 2012, by the way, is this Newsfront video shows us that he basically took $4 million of the money and returned it to tens of thousands of customers. It had been mismanaged by VistaCorp. What does that mean? I always wondered, what exactly did VistaCorp do to steal that money? Well, Scott tells us. Someone either overlooked or deliberately created a glitch in the payment processing software, skimming millions of dollars from customer accounts. Sneaky. So that's kind of cool. Just the fun little Easter eggs like this, I think, really is what made the book a joy to read from beginning to end. All right, so now we move to Ant-Man and the Wasp and a flashback to when he went to jail. And Luis returns in the book. Awesome. So happy since he wasn't in Quantumania. Guys, he should have been in Quantumania, Marvel. But anyway, he does return in the book. So we learned from this flashback, of course, this is when he first got into jail, learned he was being dumped by his wife, and he met Luis. So this is kind of fun. In the book, Scott is kind of basically saying, hey, I've made so many mistakes in my life. What would my life have been like, and how would it be different if I'd made different choices? But Luis, going through one of his long stories, of course, concludes with this very poignant statement of, hey, but above and beyond all that, he wrapped up, right, Luis's stories, is the greatest tragedy of all time. If you don't go to prison, you and I don't get to be besties. Aw. So it was kind of nice just to see Luis, at least in print, since we didn't see him in the movie. Okay, so how long was Scott in jail? Well, you would hope they got this right in the book, right? Because in the movie, Ant-Man, we learn it was 3 years in San Quentin, which they're consistent. Yay. He says, Scott writes, why should you or anyone else take life advice from a guy who's been arrested multiple times and spent 3 years in prison? So very cool. So we learned about that prison time. Now we're finally to the Ant-Man movie. So I thought this was interesting. What's something that Scott missed while he was in jail? So I'm just showing Cassie here because he's going to talk about missing something while he was in jail with Cassie. In fact, he says, I missed your Unicorns versus Dragons 4th birthday party. Okay, that's kind of cool, number one, because it mentions the birthday parties he's missed, because he says he's missed so many, but also it's consistent because he would have been in jail when she turned 4. So very cool. Then, what happened after Scott got out of jail? One of the big questions people have had, and the timeline book will resolve it once and for all, is what is the time span of the Ant-Man movie? Notice in the upper left-hand corner, I think it's July to August. I think it's a very fast movie, fast-paced, early August even, it ends. So one of the key things is how long was he trying to get a job? How long did he work at Baskin-Robbins? Those type of things. Because in the movie, we know he eventually shows up to try at the birthday party when his ex-wife says, hey, we'll talk about visitation when you get your life in order. Well, in the book, he says, I couldn't get a job with a conviction on my record. I had no funds or place to stay. Even my one joyful attempt to reunite with Cassie was cut short by Maggie and her fiancé telling me I had to get my life together before we could talk visitation or shared custody. To me, that sounds like that all happened pretty quickly. So I still think the Ant-Man movie covers, less than a month, a span of time. Let me know what you think in the comments on that, because this actually has been a big point of debate, because at the end of the movie, you might remember there's a cell phone that shows an October date. So the question is, was that an accident or was it intentional? Well, the plot thickens a bit because we learn a little bit about the bee attack. A little bit more about the bee attack, if you will, when Cassie was a child. So, Scott writes, when Cassie was 9 years old, her third grade teacher assigned the class to write an essay on my hero. So Cassie writes, it was a school night, I was in bed, then there was a big crash, I heard mommy scream, and suddenly there was a giant bee guy in my bedroom. Well, here's the key. It was a school night. Oof. That makes the ending in August not work as well, potentially, because I think it's early August. This would mean she's in school, which in LA, school does not start until mid to late August. They might be saying the movie goes till October, which we saw on that cell phone, which would move Cassie's birthday potentially to October. So interesting. I really want to know when her birthday is. As you know from Quantumania, they messed it all up. And we're going to see a little bit more about that before we get done. But anyway, very interesting. We know she was in school when this happened. Was attending school at that point. All right. So now we move on to Civil War. I thought this was interesting too. So when did Cap and Falcon contact Scott? In the Civil War movie, it doesn't happen until May, based on when I think Civil War happens, in the timeline at least. And then, here's Falcon saying, hey, I know a guy, and he remembers, of course, his battle with Ant-Man in the Ant-Man movie. So Scott says, literally no sooner had I pulled off the Pimtech operation than I found myself face-to-face with the Avengers. Well, two of them anyway, Captain America and the Falcon. Well, that makes it sound like it was really soon after the Ant-Man movie. That's another reason they may be pushing it into October. It still is, even if it's in October at the end of the movie, we're still talking 6 months. So I don't know why he would say literally no sooner. But nonetheless, I don't know. I'm thinking Ant-Man may go to October. And then also on page 64, he says, it all started right after the Pimtech heist, when I was recruited by some Avengers to go fight some other Avengers. What a great way to describe Civil War. Anyway, just really, really want to know when Ant-Man ends. Can't wait for the book to come out. I really hope it answers it once and for all. Okay, so this is kind of a fun little Easter egg. But so how did that Giant Man lab test go? Because remember in the movie, when he's asked, when Falcon, I think, says, we need something big. We need something big. And Ant-Man's like, oh, I can do that. I do it all the time. Once in a lab, and then I passed out. So the book actually gives us a little bit more about that lab experiment. He says, I hit the regulator button and boom, big me. Now I had been expecting a sudden shoot up in the air. What I didn't expect was that I would suddenly feel off balance. And then the experimental effects hit my brain and I passed out, but with a tiny, big smile on my face. So that's just kind of fun that they give us a little more backstory on the stuff that was mentioned in the movies. All right, so what did Scott think about that Spider-Man move, right? One of the funniest parts of the battle is when Spider-Man basically realizes he can use the Empire Strikes Back move on Scott. And there's Spider-Man saying, you know that part where they're on the snow planet? So what did Scott say about this? Well, he said, and then I felt my legs start to lock up. And as before in the lab, I began to stagger. This was a loss of balance being deliberately brought on by Spider-Man, tying a web rope around my legs and blabbing on about the Empire Strikes Back. But then he says, which, by the way, excellent taste, kid. That's kind of fun. There's multiple things going on here. Number one, he refers to him as Spider-Man. So you might say, oh, then this book must have been written after the memory spell and he forgot who Peter Parker was. Well, keep in mind, he's not going to give out Peter Parker's identity, even if this was before the memory loss spell. Plus, I don't think he even knew Peter Parker, right? He didn't know his secret identity. So him calling him Spider-Man makes sense. He does refer to other people we'll see by their true identities, but he's calling him just Spider-Man. So that's cool. But I also like the fact that this kind of shows, hey, no hard feelings, right? I mean, good move, kid. You got me. We're all good. It's kind of fun that the superheroes have some camaraderie between them, even though they tried to punch each other out in Civil War. So this is kind of fun. Did Scott give away the location of the raft? Remember, this is the prison that he stayed in with a couple other of the heroes from Civil War. And theoretically, it's a secret location, right? But in his book, he says, after the mission and after a fun little stay in the very secret, very wet superhero prison under the East River, I did sneak the suit back to Lewis in a trophy, relatively unstained and in one piece. So I don't know if it's really located under the East River. It doesn't seem like it to me. I think he's probably joking, but it would be kind of funny if he ended up revealing the location. But also another little trivia thing here, a little Easter egg, is we learned that he got the suit back relatively unstained using Lewis. Lewis helped him. So that's kind of fun. All right. So how long was Scott on home detention? This is kind of a question we've been trying to figure out because there's a little less than 2 years between when I feel at least the end of Civil War is and the beginning of Ant-Man and the Wasp. Because Civil War, notice, ends in June of 2016. Ant-Man and the Wasp, I think, starts in April of 2018. Again, Timeline book is going to hopefully give us the exact months, but for now, it seems a little under 2 years. And in the movie, of course, they say, provided he served 2 years on house arrest. Well, in the book, he's even more specific. He says, so you could say I spent those 24 months doing nothing. Nothing but talking with friends a lot, learning to appreciate the simple blessings of my life, and trying new things. So, was it exactly 24 months? I don't know. I guess we'll find out. I had always assumed he got a little bit of time served for staying on the raft. In fact, you should get double or triple time, because that's way different than home detention. But anyway, we'll find out. But that was kind of interesting. 24 months, he says specifically. All right, so here's one of the interesting things. I would call this a retcon, except Peyton Reed already retconned it. And unfortunately, maybe I need to apologize to Peyton Reed, because I guess he's right, because they're really sticking with this. So how old was Cassie in Ant-Man and the Wasp? I mean, I thought the movie was really clear. Hey, you try and entertain a 10-year-old. And some people have said, well, maybe Scott got it wrong. Yeah, but Cassie didn't go, Dad, I'm like 9. So anyway, it's really clear. She was 10. But Peyton Reed in an interview said she was 9, and apparently, according to the book, she was 9. Because there are some pictures, which is kind of fun, and this one is labeled, if there's one thing that improves house arrest, it's a beloved family member, ideally of the under 10 variety, as shown here. Also, note me styling with that super cool bathrobe. Now, you could say, well, we don't know when this picture was taken. Actually, we kind of do. It looks like it was taken during this scene here, because notice he's in the same bathrobe, same couch. She's got the same hair braids on. I couldn't find the exact frame of the picture, but I'm sure it is. Of course, that leads to the question, who took this picture, right? But the ants, I guess. The ants were probably photographing a lot. In fact, it mentions in the book that many of his adventures are photographed by the ants, that they document it. So maybe they took this picture too. But yeah, that would mean she was under 10 in Ant-Man and the Wasp. Okay, Peyton, I'll officially say it. I'm sorry. You were right. I mean, you're wrong because you retconned your own movie. But it is an official retcon, not, as I have suggested, Peyton Reed showing up drunk to an interview. He was sober. He was sober. All right. Sorry, Peyton. Love you, man. Group hug. All right. Anyway, so this is just kind of a fun little Easter egg. Where did Scott get all the boxes, right? Remember at the beginning, he made this really cool maze for Cassie, and they went through, and there were lasers and a prize and all that. And then you could see on the right, there's all the boxes. Well, he actually explains it. Fortunately, even with the minimal amount of deliveries I'd had, still left me with a decent supply of delivery box cardboard to work with. So, yep, Amazon supplied all this. What on earth was he ordering, though? Because those are some big boxes. Nonetheless, love it. Love it. All right. So did Scott confess to a crime in the book? Right? We remember that he secretly was able to sneak out of the house in Ant-Man and the Wasp because he had one of the ants put on his GPS tracker that's supposed to keep him, so they know he's on home detention, right? That was a secret. They weren't supposed to know. Well, good old Scott. Do I even need to elaborate on the ant who agreed to get large, slip on my house arrest ankle monitor, and pretend to be me to throw off the feds during my house arrest? Scott, you're literally confessing to breaking a federal law in your book. Now, I don't know if there's a statute of limitations. Maybe he's past that and they can't arrest him, but honestly, he did save half the world, right? He brought back half the world. So it's all forgiven. But still, I had to crack up. I'm thinking it's probably not a good idea to confess to crimes in your memoir. It's just me, just me. Anyway, so how long was the blip? Well, you'd really hope they got this right, right? Surely they got it right. So when he first approaches Natasha after coming out of the van all those times, she says, I'm sorry, there must have been a very long 5 years. So we know it's a 5-year blip. And yay, he says the same. I wasn't around for those 5 years of missing people. Okay, great. So no surprise there, right? So how much of Cassie's life has Scott missed? One of the big story points of Quantumania was all his missed time with Cassie, which, by the way, I don't know why this book didn't come out before Quantumania. It would have probably sold even more. I don't know if it's selling much now. I really have no idea. But it would have sold a ton if it had come out before Quantumania. So I have no idea why they did that, because there's no spoilers for Quantumania. It was literally written before the movie, so it would have no spoilers. But anyway, how much of Cassie's life has Scott missed? Well, he answers that. He says, maybe that's because we've been robbed of so much time together. So much time. Basically, half your life. Which makes me want to rush in and say all the things I couldn't say to you when I was in prison and then trapped in the quantum realm for all those years. So you take the 3 years in prison, the 5 years in the quantum realm, that's 8 years of her life. And assuming he wrote this around the time of Endgame or soon after, which we'll get to more when I think he wrote the book, she would be 16. So that's literally half her life. So very cool. I thought that was fun. Nice little continuity thing there. Okay, what was Scott thinking during the testing? Remember this, where they were testing the time travel to see if it would work, and he's a teenager at one point, he's an old Scott, and he's little baby Scott. This is fascinating. So he explains in the book, experiencing life with my fully conscious, present-day adult Scott brain, but inside those Scott at different ages of life bodies had changed me. I wasn't really quite the same at all. Wild. So he's saying his brain didn't go back in time. His brain was still the fully conscious present-day brain. But then this is really interesting how his body and his emotional, chemical reactions of his body took over. As he goes on to say, take my brief foray into adolescence. What I felt was this sudden wave of contempt for my superhero friends. Now, the only thing I saw them as was super annoying grown-ups. Too funny. So, it's been said before, but now completely confirmed, that Scott and Hulk basically invented immortality and threw it away. Why they're not selling this, I don't know. Because basically, you could use this to continue to send yourself back maybe in your 20s, so you don't have adolescence taking over, or even your 30s. But hey, you're 60? Nope, now you're 30 again, with the same memories. Wild. Nope, they don't do anything with it. So probably better, but nonetheless, pretty wild. Okay, here is what I found the most interesting, probably one of the biggest reasons I wanted to read the book. How did the time heist work? What would we learn from the book about it? And boy, we learned a lot. Okay, so if you remember, Hulk rather confusingly said, if you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. So he was saying that to basically say the Back to the Future butterfly effect rules, that's all BS. It doesn't work that way. Instead, if you go to the past, that's now your future. So while he didn't use the word branching, obviously the Loki show discusses branching. What If discusses branching. So the implication was you branch if you go back in time. But it led to debates where some people said, no, they went back to their own time. Like literally Steve Rogers went back and lived in the main MCU. And when they went back to 2012, that was in the main MCU. I don't see how that's possible, but that's been a point of debate, okay? So Scott does answer that once and for all, although it's a little confusing too. But anyway, let's dive into this. So he says, the idea was we would identify specific recent points on alternate timelines where we knew an infinity stone to be. And then we'd use the quantum realm tunnel to jump to that timeline and grab the stone there. Okay, first of all, he's making it crystal clear they went to an alternate timeline. So there's no way Steve Rogers went to, the main MCU. That's been answered, right? And likewise, when they went to 2012, it was an alternate timeline, 2014, 2013, ultimately 1970. Alternate timelines. What I didn't expect him to say, though, was jump to that timeline. That's kind of weird to me. And he called it, they were looking for recent points on alternate timelines. It almost made it sound like he was saying they were scanning, they had some device that let them scan alternate timelines to figure out which one to go to. Now, I don't think that's what they were intending to say. I think he was trying to say they looked for the points in their own past where they could find the stones, knowing that when they went there, they would be in an alternate past, an alternate timeline. But still, this does open the door to the fact that they jumped to alternate timelines. So they clarify one thing, you can't go into your own past. And then they make it even more confusing by making it sound like, hey, we're just jumping between alternate timelines. So I really don't think that's what he meant, but he does kind of repeat it a couple times. So at one point he says we jumped to a different timeline. At another point he says jumping to and from multiple timelines. At another point he says 3 of the 6 stones could be obtained in an alternate version of New York City in 2012. Now I do like how he says he gave the other timeline, Iron Man, a mild cardiac, can't say that word, but remember that's when he made Tony have the heart attack, basically. He calls Hulk, the one that knocked Tony over, the alt 2012 Hulk. I like that. He talks about timeline hopping their way into obtaining enough Pym particles from a timeline in the 1970s. And he says at the very end of the time heist, we had to get the stones. We'd pilfered back to their original points in their original timelines. Woof. So, I don't know exactly what to do with this. I would love to hear your comments. This was the most fascinating part. I am ecstatic that they did not go back into their own timeline. So that means Marcus and McFeely, the writers, are not correct. That may be how they wrote the movie, but that's not how Marvel is choosing to go forward. And that means that the directors, the Russos, are correct, that they went to an alternate timeline. But do you think this was just Scott doing a poor job of describing going to the past and creating a branch? Or do you think they were literally surfing the multiverse to try to find a good timeline? I don't think so. Number one, the sacred timeline did not have many timelines. We've talked about that in other videos. So I don't think that's what he meant to say. And in fact, I will summarize it with this little bit of Q&A. He has some Q&A in the book, and one of the questions he's been asked many times is, can you explain exactly how the timeline heist worked? And his answer is, no, I cannot. So that's what I would prefer to think is he just did a poor job of saying, we went into the past, created another timeline, and then we had to go back there to return the stones. So anyway, let me know what you think. Wild stuff, right? Wild stuff. Okay, this is kind of fun though. Do we now have an explanation for why Ant-Man showed up in the Hawkeye series when they were watching the Save the City scene from the musical? Because remember, Hawkeye said, you know who wasn't there? Is that guy, Ant-Man. So this is kind of fun. In the book, Scott says, so the 4 of us set off through the quantum tunnel and arrived during the legendary Battle of New York of 2012. And now, unlike in our 2012, I was kind of taking part in the fight. Or at least like I was right next to it. So some have theorized, obviously the people that believe that they went back to their own timeline in the past, right? They were literally rewriting their own timeline, that's why people thought Ant-Man appeared there. No, he makes it clear they went to an alternate 2012. But I'm betting when the Avengers, debriefed with the government, and then when Scott decided to write this book, which we're going to get into that a little more at the end, that, people realized he went back and was part of, in the alternate timeline, the Battle of New York. So whoever wrote this musical then said, wouldn't that be fun to shove Ant-Man in it? I have no idea if that's the explanation, but I just thought that was kind of interesting how Scott drops the idea that he was sort of there. Funny, right? Funny, funny, funny. Okay, so this is another fun little Easter egg. What did Scott write about Loki? Remember, Loki grabs the Tesseract and bolts off. I love this. He says, Alt Hulk knocked Tony over, the case slid across the floor, and in the end, all my distraction did was allow Alt 2012 Loki to escape with the Space Stone. One can only imagine what that led to. Yes, one can only imagine. Destroying the multiverse, that's what it led to. So wild. Love that. Love that. All right, what did Scott write about Wanda? One of the big questions we've had is how, before this book was mentioned, is how on earth did everybody know what even happened during the Endgame battle? In particular, the first time was in WandaVision, when there's a discussion between Jimmy Woo and Monica about whether about whether Wanda could have taken out Thanos on her own if he hadn't initiated the Blitz and rained fire on everyone. But how did they know, right? Well, because we know this book was written, eventually everybody would know. My guess is, because we're talking November 2023 for WandaVision, right? This is right after Endgame. My guess is the Avengers debriefed the government on what happened. Surely the government wanted to know, right? And both Jimmy Woo with the FBI and Monica at SWORD are part of the government. So they would have had some of this privy information. So I think that's why they knew what happened. But here still is what eventually Scott would write and what they were probably told at the time. He wrote, "I got a nice view of Wanda lifting and toasting Thanos redly, only to hear him bellow for his hench creatures to rain fire on the whole battle. His own troops be damned." So yeah, that's how they eventually learned about it. But I do think that Monica and Jimmy were probably given, a debriefing early on. So this does explain, however, how people like Kamala, Miss Marvel, knew about Miss Marvel, or Captain Marvel, rather. Because remember, in the first episode of Miss Marvel, she was talking about how, Carol Danvers came in, rescued the day, stopped the rain of fire. Well, in the book, Scott writes, but suddenly there was a different and somehow brighter piece of fire that rained down on the fire rainers, lethally crumbling that spaceship of doom and sending it to the ground. The bigger fire was none other than Carol Danvers, a.k.a. Captain Marvel. So while the book wasn't out at the time of WandaVision, obviously, it was most definitely out during the time frame of Miss Marvel in September to October of 2025. So yeah, very cool that that's how she learned about her hero, Captain Marvel. So very cool. All right. A couple really touching chapters. What did Scott write about Natasha's death? Because you wonder, how would the world have even known about her sacrifice? Because only Hawkeye knew about it. Well, that's why, as we'll see a little bit later, Hawkeye specifically asked Scott to write the book and why he was a perfect one to give Scott the information, because he was able to share things like this. Of course, Scott writes, of course, she ultimately prevailed, escaping Hawkeye's fingers and plummeting into both sacrifice and history. Nat's last words in this life were, "Let me go." And then Scott writes, if you're somehow reading this somewhere, Nat, don't worry about that first tussle we had, referring to Civil War, because in the end, the only person who got hurt was me for not getting to be your pal. Wow. Really cool. It's a really cool chapter. And I love the fact that this is how people now know the valiant sacrifice, the amazing sacrifice that Natasha made for the world, to save the world. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about, wait, if this is in the book, why didn't Yelena know about this? Don't worry, that will all come into play, so hold on to that thought. But this is a great chapter. Another very powerful chapter is what Scott wrote about Tony's death, again, letting everyone know about his sacrifice. In that one, he wrote, the final moments of Iron Man are best left unspoken. But there's really just one critical thing you need to know. Tony Stark, a man who either had or could have had literally anything he wanted in the world, instead gave up his life to save the world. Oof, man. It's just gut punch. Really, really well written. Takes you back to those emotional moments for both Black Widow and Iron Man in Endgame. Really well written, and I'm sure the people reading it got a good feeling for the sacrifice that the Avengers made. Okay, here's a fun little Easter egg, I would call it, or trivia. So did Hulk bring back all life lost to the blip? I mean, what does that really mean? What does all life mean? Well, Scott humorously explains it. So when Hulk snapped his fingers and brought back the half that had been blipped by Thanos, he says, and then something weird happened. In the sky, I saw birds. But that's not the weird thing. What was weird was suddenly there were way more birds than before. You might even say probably twice as many. So this is interesting. Remember, they said repeatedly, it's just easy to forget that they said, Thanos wiped out all life. Not obviously just all humanity, all life. So that's half of all animals were blipped. And that means during, the 5 years, there was only half as many animals. And then suddenly in 2023, boom, the other half of the animals all came back. Now, I'd have been fine if he hadn't brought back the mosquitoes, but nonetheless, half the animals suddenly reappearing. So I did a video on just how impactful the blip would have been on the MCU. And the timeline, by the way. And this just adds one more element to it. So go check out that video if you've never seen it. But yeah, add to it the animals. Gone and then back. Wild. Okay, so next question. Who asked Scott to write the book? Now, I alluded to earlier that it was Hawkeye, but it was also Hulk who asked him to write it. And it's a perfect duo to approach Scott. I mean, Hawkeye could share the story of Natasha that no one else knew and her sacrifice. And of course, Hulk could at least try to explain the time heist. I'm not sure Scott said it very well in the book, but nonetheless, the perfect two. So in the book, he says, one day, Bruce, the Hulk, Banner, and Clint, Hawkeye, Barton, not sure if he was supposed to give out Hawkeye's secret identity there, but he did, took me out to lunch. They said they were concerned that the world didn't really know what happened. And you're a guy everyone likes and trusts. Very cool. So, yeah, it makes sense that these two would approach him, and seemingly it was shortly after Endgame, probably shortly after they gave a debrief to the government on everything that happened. So I love that. Then the question is, when exactly was he asked to write the book? Well, we don't know the exact moment, but we do know this. It was before Shang-Chi. And as I mentioned in an earlier timeline video, Shang-Chi has now been established based on an accidental leak from the timeline book. But anyway, it is for sure in March to April of 2024. So why is that important? Well, Scott says 2 quick handshakes. Bruce, now permanently in his Hulk body, made sure to keep his hand not too firm, and it was settled. So what he's saying there is, at the time when they approached him and asked him to write the book, Hulk was permanently in his Hulk body. Well, obviously by the time of the end credit of Shang-Chi, which would be around April of 2024, Hulk had figured out the inhibitor and was able to, be Bruce again. So he probably would have said it differently if they had approached him, after Shang-Chi. It really makes sense if you think about it. I mean, surely they approached him very soon after Endgame. But this tells us for certain it was prior to March of 2024. And then also, I like this, he adds, they would supply me with all the archival footage and documentation, take me anywhere I needed to go, and let me ask as many questions as I needed. So, great, love it. Okay, so when exactly was the book written? We know who asked him to write it and when they asked him to write it, but when did he actually write it and how long did it take? Well, we don't know for sure, but it's really interesting. In Quantum Mania, I thought he was talking about the movie itself in present day. He was actually reading from the book when he said, it's been a crazy few years. Because basically in the book, this is the narration. He says, it's been a crazy few years for everyone. So let's take time for the stuff that really matters. So these are not lines that are happening during Quantumania. This is stuff from his book. So I think his book was probably written, therefore, in 2024. Because when he says a crazy few years, he's really referring to the blip. So, yeah. Okay, so again, it certainly makes sense that he got to work right after Hulk and Hawkeye asked him to write it. And by the time he put pen to paper, he's referring to the blip there, crazy few years. Also, this is kind of interesting. In the book, he says, over the last 10 years or so, I've had a lot of infitting to a gang of, let's say, fist-forward fellow inmates, to semi-awkward post-divorce blended family situation with Maggie and Paxton, and of course, to the Avengers and company. Well, he says 10 or so years. Well, if he wrote the book in 2024, then 10 or so years would take you back to 2012 when he was first arrested and in jail because he talks about, the fellow inmates. So that works, 10 years or so. So yeah, I'm pretty sure he wrote and finished, I believe, the book in 2024. Now, this is interesting. Some people have said, how did he get Stephen Strange in particular, the middle endorsement on the back of his book? How did Stephen Strange write an endorsement? Because, he went nutso with the third eye and took off to solve the incursion in November of 2024. Well, a couple things. Number one, a lot of people give endorsements and don't read the book. I love this endorsement. Stephen Strange says, if you always hoped Ant-Man would write a book, you're in luck. I confess I did not, but I enjoyed it all the same. Well, a lot of people don't even read the book. So he might have just written that, said, here, put this there. He might have also read an early transcript of it. But I do think the book was being written and probably even completed around the time of Multiverse of Madness. So don't let this throw you off that Stephen Strange said that, because I don't think he read the book. We all know Doctor Strange, right? He didn't read the book. Okay, but this is more interesting. When did the book come out? So I think he was asked to write the book right after Endgame. He spent a good portion of 2024 writing it out. And then it would have been released. Well, you would think the book was released after December 2024, or Yelena wouldn't have been confused about why Natasha died, right? Now, you might say, well, Yelena's busy. She didn't have time to read the book. And I agree, she probably didn't. However, the book would have made the news big time, just like I'm doing a video on it now. As soon as the book was released in the MCU, there would have been all kinds of news stories about it, like tons of them. So I would think Natasha's story would be on the news and Yelena would have known. So therefore, I'm guessing the book came out after December of 2024. Val got lucky because little did she know her little scheme wouldn't have worked if the book had come out much sooner. So, okay, that's when I think it came out. But don't let this fool you. I've had a couple people say, well, no, we know when it came out, 2023. So it would have been right after Endgame. But then look at the first edition, September of 2023. I guarantee it was not written while Scott was in the quantum realm. Instead, this is just the legal disclaimers they have to put. I mean, it's the copyright for the book. They could have put an in-universe 2025 date and said first edition February of 2025, but this is literally, then they wouldn't have copyrighted their book until 2025. So no, this is the only page that is not in universe. It is real life stuff. So anyway, I think the book came out in early 2025. So then when did the book tour begin? Well, remember, we know from a Easter egg, little news ticker, that Scott was continuing his tour of his autobiography in May of 2025. So we know the book had to be out by then, but again, I think it came out after Hawkeye. So very cool. And then finally, in Quantum Mania, we see Scott reading the book. I do not believe this is part of the tour because we're a full year later, although, you know, obviously this book, he would have been so famous. He could have been doing a tour for a year, but I think this is just him reading it in his local library. But we'll close the video by giving Scott's final advice in the book, which is very appropriate. He says, and for the rest of you kids out there, a word of advice: look out for the little guy. Yes, indeed. Excellent advice. So I liked the book. I hope you check it out. I thought it was a fun read. It's nothing earth-shattering, but it was fun. It was fun. It was worth the cost and worth the time. All right, so don't forget, we do have the September contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, and the winner is chosen at random in early October. And also, I like to mention, we have the Discord server. Love to have you join us. In fact, you can see here, there's Papaworks posting his notes. So thank you again, Papaworks. You did a great job with that. I will leave a pinned comment so you can join the server if you're interested. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.